Hello and welcome to this introduction to cell biology video. I'm Dr. Aled Roberts, and in this video we're going to look at the history of cells, from the discovery of cells right through to defining what a cell is and all the history in between. And it all starts way back in the mid-17th century when a physicist and inventor named Robert Hooke built one of the very first compound microscopes. Using this tool, he examined very thin slices of cork and noticed a series of tiny box-like compartments. Now, he called these compartments cells because they reminded him of the small rooms or cellula that monks lived in. Of course, what Hooke was actually looking at were the empty cell walls of dead plant tissue, but this was the first time anyone had described the microscopic structure of living tissue. Then, in 1665, he published his now famous manuscript, Micrographia. This was a groundbreaking piece of work because it included detailed illustrations of what he saw under the microscope, including the structures of cork and different molds. He even suggested that some of these microscopic structures might represent forms of plant life, and so through Micrographia, Hooke didn't just share his observations, he opened the door to a whole new way of studying the natural world. And so a little while after Hooke's work came the work of Antoine van Leeuwenhoek, often called the father of microbiology. Now, Leeuwenhoek wasn't a scientist by training, but he had a fascination with lenses and spent years creating an upgraded version of the microscope with increased resolving power, slightly more magnification through the use of powerful lenses, and a dedicated sample holder allowing for better focusing of samples. And with this setup, Leeuwenhoek became the very first person to observe and document single-celled microorganisms through his famous Letters on the Protozoa in 1677. In this publication, he described what he called animalcules, which translates to small animals. Now, what he was actually seeing was both protozoa and bacteria, but he didn't know what they were yet. Now, his experiments and observations literally changed how we viewed the microscopic world. Okay, so after the work of Leeuwenhoek, there was a bit of a wait before one of the next key discoveries, and so jumping forward to the early 19th century, we meet the Scottish botanist Robert Brown. Now, Brown was best known for two things. One of them you might have heard of already, Brownian motion. This is his observation that tiny pollen grains suspended in water seem to jiggle around randomly. He didn't know why at the time, and the explanation came much later with that understanding of molecular motion, but his name stuck with this phenomenon ever since. But when it comes to cell biology, Brown's important contribution came in 1831 when he was studying orchids under the microscope, and he noticed a distinct dark round structure within the cells of the plant. Now, he quickly realised this wasn't just an artefact, it was present in many different types of plant cells and reproducible across many different samples. And so Brown named this structure the nucleus, and this was the very first time that the cell nucleus had been formally observed and described. And so Brown essentially gave us the name and concept of the nucleus, a structure we now know plays a central role in controlling cell activities and storing genetic material. However, at the time, nothing was said about its potential function within the cell. That came a lot later on. Now, a few years later, still within the 1830s, two scientists, Matthias Schleiden, a German botanist, and Theodor Schwann, a German zoologist, were studying different organisms. As a botanist, Schleiden's research focused on plants, whereas Schwann was a zoologist, and so much of his research focused on animals. Now, through their independent research on different organisms, they both came to the same conclusion about cells. They suggested that all living things are made up of equal parts, known as cells. Now, the interesting thing about their research was that they recognized that cells are not just structural components of all living things, they are the elementary units of life, meaning they are the smallest known unit capable of carrying out the processes necessary for life on Earth. What those processes were remained a mystery at this point in time. However, their research laid the foundations for a fundamental theory in modern biology known as cell theory. But what is cell theory? Well, it's a series of principles born from the work of Schleiden and Schwann which underpin all biological systems. Now, this has undergone revisions through time as we know and understand more about the biological world, but at the time, three key principles were developed. The first principle is that all living things are composed of one or more cells. This means that from the simplest of bacterial cells all the way up to the largest multicellular mammal in the blue whale are all made up of cells, and that these cells are the fundamental units of life. The second principle is that the cell is the basic unit of structure and function. Cells aren't just building blocks of life, they carry out all the essential processes required to keep organisms alive, from energy production to waste removal. Now, the next principle required the work of two important scientists, Robert Hooke and Rudolf Virchow. Hooke was the first to identify, through his study on blood cells, that new cells arise from the division of pre-existing ones. Now, whilst Hooke was the first to identify this, Virchow was the one who popularised the idea with his famous phrase, omnis cellula e cellula, which translates to every cell from a cell. Now, together they overturned the earlier belief in spontaneous generation and developed a third principle of cell biology, that all cells arise from pre-existing cells. Essentially, life comes from life, and new cells are produced only when existing cells divide, ensuring the continuity of life across generations. Now, these three principles laid the foundations of cell theory, and through the work of hundreds of scientists since, we've been able to expand our understanding, adding additional principles. And so the fourth principle builds off of the second principle and states that metabolism and biochemistry of an organism occurs within each and every cell. Essentially, each cell is a tiny chemical factory carrying out the essential processes required to support life, such as energy production, growth, waste removal, etc., with the aim of keeping itself alive and, by extension, the organism as a whole. The fifth principle is that cells contain hereditary information, meaning the genetic content of the organism is stored within the genome of each and every cell, and that the genome contains specific instructions in the form of genes that are required for growth, reproduction, and the maintenance of life. Now, this actually builds on principle number 3, in that this information must be passed from one generation of cells to the next. The sixth principle builds off of the first principle in that whilst all living things are composed of cells, the composition of cells is similar within a species but differs between different species. And so whilst all cells share the same key elements for life in the form of nucleic acids, amino acids, fatty acids and carbohydrates, the exact composition varies, giving rise to the diversity we see across Earth today. And so hopefully you can start to see through these additional principles we've started to link cell biology with genetics, biochemistry and evolution. However, 2 more principles have been added which help to explain the contribution of individual cells to larger, more complex multicellular organisms. And so the 7th principle is that the function of all component cells underpins the capabilities of the entire organism. In other words, what an organism can do, whether that is moving, sensing the environment, digesting food, or mounting an immune response, it all comes down to the coordinated work of its cells. If the cells function well, the organism thrives. If the cells fail, the organism as a whole will suffer. And the final principle, at least for now, is that whilst cells may differentiate and specialise within a multicellular organism, they still share the same fundamental properties. In multicellular organisms, this specialisation is striking. Muscle cells contract, nerve cells transmit signals, red blood cells carry oxygen, and kidney cells filter waste. Their shapes and roles are very different, but at their core, every one of these cells relies on the same essential processes, producing energy, expressing genes, and carrying out the basic chemistry of life. And so when we put all of this together, cell theory tells us not only that all living things are made up of cells, but that the health, function and diversity of those cells explain the remarkable abilities of living organisms, and that is where we are at today. What began as a simple idea in the 1830s by Schleiden and Schwann, that all living things are made of cells, has grown into a comprehensive theory that underpins all of modern biology. Their early work laid the foundation for everything we now understand about cells, but the real wonder lies in how far this idea has taken us. From that single unifying concept, we can now explain the growth and repair of tissues, the inheritance of traits, the spread of disease, and even the origins of life itself. Cell theory essentially connects the microscopic to the macroscopic. The tiniest molecular interactions within a cell ripple outwards to shape the health, behaviour and evolution of the whole organisms and even entire ecosystems. It tells us that the complexity of a human being, with all our thoughts, emotions and abilities, ultimately rests on the coordinated activity of cells within our bodies working together. And so in this sense, cell theory is not just a scientific principle, it is a reminder of the unity of life. Every living thing, from the simplest bacteria to the most complex animal, it is all built on the same cellular foundation. And in recognizing this, we gain a deeper appreciation for the diversity of life on Earth. And with that, we come to the end of this video. Hopefully you found the content useful, informative, and most importantly, easy to understand. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.